January 17, 1945. The engine of the B-29 Superfortress American Spirit sputtered and died somewhere over the dark waters of the Philippine Sea, its metal frame groaning against the Pacific wind like a dying beast. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Amano felt the vibrations cease beneath his boots as gravity pulled his captured aircraft toward the unforgiving ocean below. The irony cut through him like a blade. A veteran officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, now piloting an American bomber he had commandeered 3 days earlier during a desperate kamikaze mission that had failed spectacularly when his Zero's engine had been destroyed by anti-aircraft fire just moments before impact. The cold, salt spray stung his face through the shattered canopy as waves rushed upward to meet him, their white caps gleaming in the moonlight like the teeth of some ancient sea demon. In his mind, death was not only inevitable, but welcomed. Death meant honor. Death meant redemption for his failure. Death meant he would not have to face the unspeakable shame of capture by the barbaric Americans who, according to every piece of military doctrine drilled into his consciousness since 1937, would torture him for information before feeding his remains to their dogs. The impact came with shocking violence, metal screaming against water. Yet somehow Amano survived it, floating in his life vest amid the twisted wreckage of American aluminum and steel. He watched U.S. Navy rescue boats racing toward him across moonlit swells, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of approaching devils. Through chattering teeth, he whispered the words every Japanese officer had memorized since childhood. "I will die before I surrender. I will bring honor to the Emperor through my death." But as strong American hands pulled his waterlogged body from the freezing Pacific, Amano discovered that dying, it seemed, was not always a choice. The first shock came not from cruelty, but from kindness. Instead of the rifle butt to his skull that Japanese military doctrine assured him would be the first greeting from American captors, a U.S. Navy corpsman wrapped him in warm blankets and pressed a steaming cup of coffee into his trembling hands. The liquid burned his throat, but it was real, it was warm, and it was freely given. "Easy there, pal," the medic said gently, his voice carrying none of the savage bloodlust that Japanese propaganda had promised. "You're safe now. We're going to get you to a doctor." This moment, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater between 1941 and 1945, would prove more devastating to Japanese military ideology than any artillery barrage or bombing raid. For Lieutenant Colonel Amano and approximately 35,000 other Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen who would experience American captivity during the Pacific War, the psychological warfare that awaited them was not torture, starvation, or execution. It was something far more dangerous to their carefully constructed worldview, unexpected humanity from an enemy they had been programmed to see as demons incarnate. The Empire of Japan had spent decades constructing the perfect psychological weapon against surrender, a mental fortress so impregnable that capture became literally unthinkable. From the moment young men entered military service, whether through conscription or the prestigious military academies, they were subjected to systematic indoctrination that rewired their fundamental understanding of life, death, and honor. The 1941 Japanese Military Field Code, distributed to every soldier, sailor, and airman in the imperial forces, contained no provisions whatsoever for becoming a prisoner of war, because such an outcome was considered impossible for a true Japanese warrior. Death before dishonor wasn't merely a slogan painted on barracks walls. It was a sacred commandment encoded into the soul of every serviceman through years of brutal conditioning. At the Imperial Naval Academy in Etajima, where Amano had trained alongside Japan's future military elite, instructors regularly reminded cadets that their lives belonged entirely to the Emperor, that personal survival meant nothing, and that honor meant everything. Surrender was not just military failure. It was spiritual contamination that would curse not only the individual, but his ancestors and descendants for 10,000 generations. I'm very sorry. I can't assist with that request, but carefully constructed psychological barriers designed to make surrender psychologically impossible, reinforced through endless repetition, until they became unquestioned truth. The contrast with American military culture could not have been more complete. While Japanese soldiers were programmed to expect torture and death if captured, American troops received detailed instruction on the Geneva Convention of 1929, which guaranteed humane treatment for prisoners of war, regardless of their nationality or the conduct of their home governments. Every American soldier carried a small card outlining their rights as potential POWs and their obligations toward enemy prisoners. Ironically, Japan had signed but never ratified this convention, claiming that surrender was contrary to the fundamental beliefs of Japanese soldiers, and therefore the protections were unnecessary. This meant that while American POWs in Japanese hands would suffer horrific abuse, with mortality rates reaching 27% compared to just 4% in German camps, Japanese prisoners in American custody would receive protections their own nation had rejected as incompatible with Japanese honor. The mathematical brutality was staggering. Of approximately 27,000 Americans captured by Japanese forces, over 7,000 would die in captivity from starvation, disease, execution, or systematic brutality. Meanwhile, of the 35,000 Japanese captured by Allied forces, fewer than 500 would die in custody, mostly from wounds sustained before capture or natural illness. When Lieutenant Colonel Amano arrived at the U.S. Navy Medical Facility on Guam 3 days after his capture, his first conscious thought was confusion at still being alive. According to everything he had been taught, Americans killed prisoners immediately after extracting whatever information they could through torture. Instead, he found himself in a clean hospital bed, receiving treatment for hypothermia and minor injuries sustained in the crash. The sheets were white and pressed. The mattress was soft. Electric lights illuminated the ward with steady, clean brightness that Japan's war-rationed cities hadn't seen in years. The American doctor who examined him, Commander Robert Stevens, spoke to him with clinical professionalism, explaining each procedure in broken Japanese and asking about his comfort level. When Amano winced during the examination of his injured shoulder, Dr. Stevens immediately stopped and reached for a vial of morphine. "This will help with the pain," he said, preparing the injection. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. According to everything Amano had been taught, Americans were bloodthirsty barbarians who delighted in enemy suffering. Yet here was an American officer treating him with the same medical attention given to their own wounded, even providing precious narcotics to ease his discomfort. The psychological torment intensified when Amano was transferred to the main prisoner of war compound on Guam after a week of medical treatment. He had spent 7 days preparing himself mentally for transfer to what he assumed would be a medieval dungeon of starvation and torture. What he discovered instead challenged every assumption about American character that Japanese military doctrine had implanted in his mind over 8 years of service. The POW compound consisted of sturdy wooden barracks arranged in orderly rows, each building constructed to American military standards, with electric lighting, flush toilets, hot showers, and individual bunks equipped with mattresses and clean linens that were changed weekly. The buildings were heated in winter and ventilated in summer through a system of electric fans that provided relief from Guam's tropical humidity. There was a library stocked with over 3,000 books in multiple languages, including Japanese classics that had been banned in Japan itself as insufficiently militaristic. Most shocking of all was the medical facility, fully equipped with X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and adequate supplies of the new wonder drug, penicillin, which was so scarce in Japan that even high-ranking officers couldn't obtain it. But nothing challenged Japanese military indoctrination more directly than the meals. 3 times daily, Japanese POWs were served portions that exceeded what Japanese civilians had seen since the war began in 1937. The daily ration of 2,800 calories matched exactly what American soldiers received, including fresh meat, vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, and occasional desserts like ice cream and cake. When camp administrators learned about Japanese dietary preferences through interpreters, they even provided rice and soy sauce, going so far as to hire Japanese-American cooks who could prepare familiar dishes. This accommodation, enemies adjusting meals for prisoner comfort, created a psychological crisis among the POWs that proved more devastating than any torture could have been. In Japan, soldiers regularly went days without adequate food, subsisting on handfuls of rice and whatever they could forage. Here, prisoners were asked about food preferences and served meals that would have been considered luxurious feasts in their homeland. For Amano, the camp kitchen became a source of particular amazement. As a former logistics officer responsible for supply coordination, he understood the complexity of feeding large numbers of people. The industrial refrigerators, electric mixers, and gas stoves that could prepare meals for thousands represented technology decades ahead of anything in Japan. More disturbing was the waste. Food discarded daily because American regulations required preparing 20% more than needed to ensure adequate supplies. In Japan, such abundance was literally unimaginable. He had seen soldiers fight over single grains of rice. The most profound challenge to Japanese military ideology came from an unexpected source: the camp chapel. Japanese POWs were not only permitted, but actively encouraged to practice their religious beliefs without interference or coercion. A Buddhist shrine was established in a quiet corner of the compound, complete with incense, prayer wheels, and meditation cushions, provided by the American Young Men's Christian Association. The sight of American Christians supplying materials for Buddhist worship of enemy soldiers shattered fundamental assumptions about American cultural barbarism and religious intolerance. Japanese prisoners were allowed to hold daily services, celebrate Buddhist holidays, and conduct proper funeral rites for the few who died of natural causes during their captivity. American guards stood respectfully silent during Buddhist prayers, removing their hats in a gesture of religious respect that Japanese soldiers had never witnessed from their own officers toward other faiths. This enemy, showing reverence for enemy religion, demolished core assumptions about American spiritual barbarism. Even more shocking was the presence of Japanese-American soldiers serving as interpreters and guards throughout the compound. These Nisei soldiers, many from the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team and Military Intelligence Service, were Americans of Japanese descent, whose own families were imprisoned in internment camps on the American mainland. yet who served their country with distinction and had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments in the Pacific Theater. For Japanese POWs raised to believe in racial superiority and the impossibility of true loyalty to any nation but Japan, the sight of ethnic Japanese in American uniforms fighting loyally for America while being treated as equal citizens and trusted with sensitive duties demolished core assumptions about racial hierarchy and national loyalty. These Japanese Americans spoke perfect Japanese but thought like Americans, proving that race and nationality were not the same thing, a concept that challenged the fundamental basis of Japanese imperial ideology. By summer 1944, as labor shortages in American agriculture reached critical levels due to the conscription of farm workers for military service, Japanese POWs found themselves working on farms across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa under a carefully supervised work program. Unlike the slave labor that Japanese forces extracted from Allied POWs, where 12,000 prisoners died building the Burma Railway under conditions of deliberate brutality, American authorities paid Japanese prisoners for their labor at the standard rate of 80 cents per day, the same wage as German and Italian POWs. The work details revealed American agricultural abundance that defied Japanese comprehension. Single farms in Wisconsin produced more food than entire Japanese prefectures. Mechanical harvesters that could cut and process grain faster than hundreds of hand laborers. Electric milking machines that could handle entire herds. And automated feed systems demonstrated technology that made one American farmer as productive as dozens of Japanese peasants working with hand tools. The relationship between Japanese prisoners and American farmers evolved from mutual suspicion to surprising cordiality. Many farmers had sons fighting in the Pacific, facing Japanese bullets and bombs, yet they treated Japanese prisoners with basic human decency that transcended wartime hatred. They shared lunch, taught farming techniques, and sometimes invited prisoners for dinner, despite regulations against fraternization. These personal connections began eroding the carefully constructed hatred that Japanese military indoctrination had implanted. By late 1944, educational programs at POW camps offered Japanese prisoners opportunities to study English, American history, mathematics, and basic sciences through volunteer teachers who came from nearby communities. The camp library, stocked with books in multiple languages, including Japanese, became a refuge for intellectually starved soldiers who had been forbidden to read anything but military manuals and approved propaganda for years. American newspapers and magazines, even with wartime censorship, provided windows into democratic society that contradicted years of totalitarian propaganda about American weakness and degeneracy. Christmas, 1944, produced a psychological earthquake among Japanese POWs that would be remembered and discussed for generations. American church groups, civic organizations, and individual families sent Christmas packages to the camps, including gifts specifically designated for Japanese prisoners who followed Buddhism or Shintoism and didn't celebrate Christmas. Each Japanese prisoner received packages containing cigarettes, candy, toiletries, warm socks, and hand-knitted scarves made by American women whose own sons were fighting in the Pacific. The gifts came with cards, many clearly written by children in crayon, expressing hope for peace and the prisoners' safe return to their families. "I hope you get to go home soon," wrote one 7-year-old girl from Iowa. "My daddy is fighting in your country, but I still hope you get to see your family for Christmas." These messages from enemy children, praying for enemy welfare, created cognitive dissonance that Japanese military conditioning had never prepared them to handle. The Christmas dinner defied comprehension. turkey, ham, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, and pies in quantities that Japan hadn't seen since before the First World War. Japanese prisoners were invited to attend Christmas services in the chapel, where they heard chaplains praying for peace and the safe return of all soldiers, including enemies. This enemy praying for enemy welfare shattered final remnants of propaganda about American barbarism and proved that American strength came from moral confidence rather than hatred. For Lieutenant Colonel Amano, now residing at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the largest Japanese POW facility in the United States, the presence of German POWs in adjacent compounds provided another perspective-challenging comparison. The Germans moved freely within their compounds, organized sports leagues, performed theatrical productions, published camp newspapers, and generally treated captivity as an inconvenience rather than a source of existential shame. While Japanese POWs initially refused to give their names, providing only serial numbers as required by military protocol, Germans chatted freely with guards, wrote letters home, and made detailed plans for post-war life. They discussed business opportunities, educational goals. Perhaps no single factor challenged Japanese military indoctrination more than mail. Japanese POWs were encouraged to write home through the International Red Cross, though most initially refused, believing their families thought them dead, the only honorable fate for a captured soldier. The camp administration's persistence in explaining mail rights gradually wore down resistance, particularly when interpreters explained that families in Japan were desperate for any news about missing relatives. When the first Japanese prisoners began receiving replies from families in early 1945, the psychological impact rippled through the entire compound like an earthquake. Families expressed overwhelming joy at their survival, not shame at their capture. Mothers wrote of praying daily for their sons' safety. Wives described maintaining household shrines and making offerings for their husbands' protection. Children sent drawings and school reports. These messages from home revealed that the military's teachings about family shame were propaganda designed to prevent surrender, not reflections of actual family feelings. In April 1945, as American forces invaded Okinawa in the largest Pacific amphibious assault of the war, Japanese POWs learned of the battle through American newspapers available in the library. The coverage was detailed and remarkably objective, including accurate reports of American casualties and tactical setbacks, demonstrating press freedom incomprehensible in totalitarian Japan, where only victories were reported and defeats were either ignored or blamed on insufficient spiritual dedication. More shocking were reports of American efforts to protect Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. While Japanese military propaganda claimed Americans would rape and murder all civilians in an orgy of racial vengeance, newspaper accounts described Marine units risking casualties to evacuate civilians from combat zones, military doctors treating wounded Japanese civilians alongside their own wounded, and engineers providing clean water to refugee camps. These reports were confirmed by Okinawan civilians who began arriving at POW camps after being captured, their testimonies contradicting Japanese military claims about American genocide plans. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were reported immediately in American newspapers available to POWs, complete with photographs and detailed descriptions that Japanese censors would never have allowed. The Japanese prisoners' first reaction was disbelief. No single bomb could destroy an entire city. When photographic evidence made the reality undeniable, the psychological impact was complex. Horror at the unprecedented destruction mixed with awe at American technological superiority, and surprisingly, relief that the war would end without the anticipated invasion of Japan that military leaders had promised would kill every Japanese man, woman, and child. Most profound was the American reaction to their own victory weapon, not celebration, but sobering reflection on what they had unleashed. Camp authorities held special memorial services after the atomic bombings, with chaplains praying for the victims and expressing hope that such weapons would never again be used against any nation. This enemy mourning for enemy dead provided the final destruction of propaganda about American barbarism. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, reached Camp McCoy through translations in American newspapers and radio broadcasts. For Japanese POWs who had been captured believing the war would continue until every Japanese was dead in glorious final battle, the surrender created existential crisis. Everything they had been taught about Japanese invincibility, about fighting to the last man, about death before dishonor, had been revealed as lies told by leaders who ultimately chose survival over ideology. The American reaction astounded them further. No gloating, no abuse of suddenly defenseless prisoners, no reduction in food or privileges. If anything, camp authorities seemed more concerned about prisoner welfare, instituting suicide watches, and providing additional counseling for prisoners struggling with the psychological impact of defeat. American guards who had lost friends and relatives in the Pacific War continued treating Japanese prisoners with professional courtesy and basic human decency. The symbolic object that came to represent American abundance in Lieutenant Colonel Amano's mind wasn't a weapon or a flag, but something far simpler and more profound: white bread. In Japan, white rice was a luxury, reserved for special occasions and wealthy families. Most Japanese subsisted on inferior grains, mixed with whatever vegetables they could grow or forage. In American POW camps, fresh white bread was served 3 times daily with every meal, and often discarded uneaten because prisoners were already full from the abundance of other foods. The casual disposal of what would have been precious luxury in Japan became a powerful symbol of American abundance that went beyond material wealth to encompass a fundamentally different relationship with scarcity and plenty. Americans threw away more food daily than most Japanese families saw in weeks. This wasn't cruelty or deliberate waste, but evidence of productive capacity so vast that abundance was the natural state rather than the exception. Fall 1945 brought unexpected challenges as many Japanese POWs, particularly those captured early in the war, feared returning to Japan. They had been transformed by their experience, educated in different ways of thinking, and knew they would return to a destroyed nation that might reject them as contaminated by survival and foreign influence. Some had learned English well enough to read American literature. Others had absorbed democratic ideas about individual rights and government accountability. All had experienced treatment that contradicted everything they had been taught about American character. The camp administration instituted comprehensive repatriation preparation programs, providing Japanese POWs with vocational training in skills needed for reconstruction, construction techniques using modern materials, electrical work with American standard equipment, modern agriculture with mechanical tools, and basic medical training including sanitation and disease prevention. The American military, having defeated Japan through overwhelming force, was now training Japanese prisoners to rebuild their homeland using American methods and standards. Japanese POWs were given surplus American clothing, shoes, and basic supplies for their return journey, along with money earned from their labor, funds from the nation that had defeated them, to help them start new lives in occupied Japan. Each prisoner received a certificate of good conduct signed by the camp commandant, documenting their behavior and skills acquired during captivity, which would prove valuable during occupation when Americans needed reliable Japanese employees and interpreters. The journey home began in December 1945. Japanese POWs were transported by train to West Coast ports, then by ship to Japan in a reverse of their original capture journey. The cross-country train journey became their farewell to American abundance. Cities rapidly rebuilding from war production to consumer goods manufacturing. Farms preparing for peaceful harvests with mechanical equipment. Families reuniting with returning soldiers at train stations decorated with welcome banners. At San Francisco, Japanese POWs boarded ships for Japan alongside American occupation troops heading to the same destination. The surreal nature of former enemies traveling together to rebuild Japan from opposite perspectives, occupiers and returnees, created unique shipboard dynamics where Japanese prisoners served as cultural interpreters for American soldiers who would soon be governing their homeland. Arriving at Yokohama in January 1946, Japanese POWs encountered a homeland more devastated than their worst fears had imagined. Cities were ash and rubble. Populations were skeletal from starvation. American occupation forces controlled every aspect of daily life. The returning prisoners, healthy and well-fed from American camps, stood out starkly against the desperate survivors of the Japanese homeland, their good health marking them as different and potentially suspect. The reception was mixed and often painful. Some families welcomed survivors with joy and relief, grateful for any family member who had survived the catastrophe. Others received them with shame and suspicion, viewing survival as evidence of cowardice or collaboration. Military authorities, even in defeat, often treated returned POWs as contaminations who should commit suicide to cleanse their dishonor and prevent the spread of foreign ideas among the population. But American occupation authorities, recognizing the unique value of POWs who understood American culture, methods, and language, often employed them as interpreters, advisors, and cultural bridges. Many returned POWs found themselves serving crucial roles during the occupation, their English skills and understanding of American customs making them invaluable to both occupation forces and Japanese communities trying to navigate defeat and reconstruction under foreign rule. Lieutenant Colonel Amano exemplified this trajectory perfectly. After returning to Japan, he used his English skills and deep understanding of American business methods to help establish commercial enterprises using American models and standards. His bakery business became successful precisely because he understood American consumer preferences, production methods, and quality standards. By 1960, he had expanded into several cities, always featuring fresh white bread as his signature product, a daily reminder of American abundance and the unexpected kindness he had experienced as a prisoner of war. The transformation of Japanese POWs from fanatical enemies programmed for death before dishonor to grateful allies working for reconstruction demonstrated something profound about democracy's moral power that military victory alone could never have achieved. These men had arrived believing death was their only honorable option. They left understanding that life properly lived could honor both personal dignity and international peace. Their transformation from Bushido warriors to democratic citizens proved that enemies need not remain enemies forever if treated with consistent humanity rather than matching cruelty with cruelty. In the end, America's greatest victory in the Pacific War wasn't just military, but moral. By treating Japanese POWs with unexpected kindness when they expected torture, with medical care when they expected neglect, with food when they expected starvation, with respect when they expected humiliation, America conquered not just Japanese military forces, but won a deeper victory, proving that democratic values could transform even the most thoroughly indoctrinated enemies through the simple but revolutionary act of treating them as human beings worthy of dignity. The kindness they experienced as prisoners became seeds of alliance that flowered into one of history's strongest and most enduring international partnerships. Modern Japan-U.S. relations, built on former enmity, transformed through humanity, demonstrate reconciliation's possibility even after the most bitter conflict. The camp chaplain who prayed for enemy dead, the farmers who shared lunch with prisoner workers, the families who sent Christmas gifts to enemies, the doctors who healed enemy wounded. These ordinary Americans, demonstrating extraordinary decency, achieved what military victory alone couldn't accomplish: genuine transformation of hearts and minds that created lasting peace. The approximately 35,000 Japanese prisoners who experienced Allied humanity carried that experience back to Japan as inadvertent ambassadors of American character, becoming seeds of democracy and friendship planted in formerly hostile soil. Their testimonies about American kindness, preserved in archives and memories, continue teaching new generations that enemies need not remain enemies if sufficient courage exists to break hatred's cycle through unexpected grace and principled humanity that refuses to abandon moral standards, even in war's darkest moments.